The old woman had no idea that a group of rich street racers was speeding toward her from behind. When they saw her, they didn't slow down. They kept laughing, swerving, and racing as if it were all a game. Only the dog sensed the danger and reacted before everything turned into a tragedy. After that, they humiliated the woman, hurt the dog, and walked away, believing money and power would cover it all. What they didn't know was that her son was a Navi SEAL, and this story would not end the way they expected. Before the story continues, tell us where you're watching from and what this story makes you feel. And if you want to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep sharing meaningful stories like this, please like the video and subscribe. Brightwater Point liked to pretend it was a simple place. On bright days, the northern sun turned the lake into hammered silver and made the pine line look like a dark green crown set carefully on the horizon. People came here for clean air and clean stories. Families with coolers, retirees with folding chairs, tourists who took photos of everything except the moments that mattered. Darlene Caraway moved through that sunlight like someone who had learned to walk with dignity even when life tried to trip her. She was in her early 60s, tall enough to seem taller because her spine never surrendered. Her hair, mostly gray now, was kept tidy in a practical twist at the back of her head. The kind of hairstyle that said she believed in keeping things in order even when the world didn't cooperate. She wore a simple jacket and sensible shoes, nothing fashionable, nothing loud. Her face held the quiet lines of discipline, the kind carved by winters, by work, by years of choosing duty over comfort. At her side walked Coda. He was a German shepherd, black and tan, 6 or 7 years old by the look of him, large-chested and powerfully built but not bulky. His coat was thick, warmed by the season, and his eyes were a deep amber brown that seemed to carry more memory than they should. There was a faded scar along one side and a subtle unevenness in the way his hind leg moved whenever he got tired, an old injury that had healed but never forgotten. Coda didn't pull like an untrained dog. He didn't bounce. He didn't beg strangers for attention. He walked with Darlene as if he had made a vow, and for Darlene, that vow meant something. She didn't speak to him like a baby. She spoke to him like a partner, soft, steady, as if every word was a stitch holding the day together. "Just a few things," she told him, glancing toward the small grocery tucked near the road. "Milk, bread, that tea you keep trying to steal from my pantry, cotis." Ears twitched at the word tea as if he found the accusation unfair. The road by the lake was usually calm at midday. It curved like a ribbon bordered by low stone walls and patches of wild grass. But today the air carried a different sound, an animal sound, mechanical and hungry. Engines. Not the gentle hum of commuters. This was louder, sharper, a growl that didn't belong in a town that claimed it loved peace. Coda felt it first. His posture changed. His head lifted. His ears stood rigid. His pace slowed, not with fear, but with a tension so intense it looked like purpose. Darlene noticed too. She followed his gaze down the road. 4 cars appeared, spaced in a loose formation like a pack that had learned how to hunt together. Bright paint, low frames, the kind of vehicles that looked like they were born to be admired. Their tires hissed against the pavement as they accelerated through the bend. And then the worst part, phones were held up through open windows. Someone was filming. Someone was laughing. In the lead car, the driver leaned forward with the careless confidence of a boy who'd never been told no in a way that mattered. His name was Trent Halwick. He was 19 or 20, handsome in the expensive polished way, clean features, bright teeth, hair styled like it had a personal assistant. He wore a designer jacket even though the weather didn't call for it because his life didn't follow weather rules. His friends called him T, like it was a crown. He wore a watch that caught sunlight and threw it back at the world like a taunt. Trent's smile was pure performance. Behind him, in the other cars, were his friends. Briar Knox, with sharp eyebrows and a laugh that sounded like it had been trained to cut. Jace Marin, broader and louder, the kind of young man who filled space with his voice because silence made him nervous. And Landon Pike, quieter, eyes always flicking around as if he enjoyed watching the chaos more than causing it. They were the children of power. Mayors, councilmen, developers, men whose names were stitched into the town's decisions like thread. They drove like consequences were for other people. Darlene tightened her grip on Coda's leash, not yanking, just anchoring. "Easy," she murmured. Coda didn't bark. He did something stranger. He stopped, suddenly, firmly, like a compass needle snapping into place. His body angled slightly, not toward the store, but away from the road. Darlene hesitated, confused for a heartbeat. Then she heard the squeal. One of the cars behind Trent surged forward, trying to pass in the curve. The tires shrieked. The back end slid. The lane narrowed by inches. The entire moment happened too fast for clean thought. Darlene stepped instinctively. 1 foot forward off the curb, trying to hurry across, trying to get out of the way. The car in the curve snapped toward the shoulder. Coda moved. Not with panic. With precision. He surged close, caught the hem of Darlene's jacket in his mouth, fabric only, not skin, and pulled sharply sideways toward the safety of the curb. It wasn't a violent yank. It was a quick angled tug that stole her rhythm for half a second. Darlene's foot landed wrong. She stumbled back, breath catching, and in that half second the car swept past, so close that the wind slapped her face and tore the grocery list from her hand like a cruel joke. A glass bottle in someone's bag shattered on the pavement. Then the noise dissolved into a rolling echo. Tires correcting, engines roaring again, laughter trailing behind. Darlene stood frozen for one stunned beat, her heart pounding against the inside of her chest. Coda released the fabric immediately and stepped in front of her. Chest forward, tail low, eyes locked on the road. He hadn't growled. He hadn't lunged. He had simply refused to let fate take her. A few feet down the street, Trent's car jerked hard as he overcorrected. His door clipped something. Maybe the stone wall, maybe his own pride. He slammed the brakes, and when he stepped out too quickly, he slipped on the scattered glass. He hit the ground with a curse, scraping his palm and elbow. It wasn't serious, just bright red and embarrassing. But embarrassment in Trent's world was an insult that demanded repayment. He stood up fast, shaking his hand as if the blood offended him. His face twisted, not from pain, but from humiliation. His friends pulled up behind him, spilling out of their cars like they were stepping onto a stage. Briar lifted his phone again. Jace laughed loud enough for the whole road. Landon's eyes flicked to Coda, then to Darlene like he was calculating. Trent pointed at Darlene. "You," he said, breath sharp, voice full of outrage that didn't belong to him. "You made me crash." Darlene stared at him, water blue eyes steady, refusing to shrink. She could have screamed. She could have begged. She did neither. "You were speeding," she said simply. That sentence landed like a slap. Jace's grin widened. "Oh, look, Grandma's got opinions." Briar walked closer, smiling like a knife. "Maybe your dog should learn manners." Coda's ears tilted forward. A low sound rose in his chest. Quiet. Controlled. Trent's eyes flicked to the torn edge of Darlene's jacket hem, where Coda had grabbed it. That was all Trent needed. He lifted his scraped hand, held it up like evidence. "Did you all see that?" he called to the phones. "That dog attacked her." He paused, then changed the story mid-sentence to fit his needs. "That dog attacked me." Darlene's jaw tightened. "He didn't touch you." "Doesn't matter," Briar murmured, still filming. "Looks like it did." Jace stepped forward and kicked Darlene's fallen grocery bag. A carton rolled out and burst, milk spreading over the road like a pale spill of luck. Landon picked up a bottle from someone's car, unscrewed it, and casually poured the cold soda over Darlene's head. She flinched, just once, more from shock than pain. The sticky liquid ran down her face and into her collar. The boys laughed. The northern sun shone on them like it couldn't tell the difference between joy and cruelty. Darlene reached for Coda's leash, not to pull him forward, only to keep him close. Trent watched her do it. Something in his expression sharpened. He stepped in, grabbed the leash, and stomped down on it with his designer shoe, pinning it to the pavement. Coda's head jerked slightly, collar tightening. His muscles tensed. A growl rose again, deeper now, still controlled but unmistakable. Trent leaned down, phone inches from Coda's face. "Go on," Trent whispered, voice syrup-sweet, eyes glittering. "Bite. Give me a reason." Coda stopped growling, not because he was afraid, not because Trent had won, because Coda saw something else. His gaze snapped past Trent, past the cars, toward the curve of the road. His ears pinned forward, his entire body went rigid like a statue carved from warning. Darlene felt it before she understood it. The sudden change in the air, the way the sunlight seemed to sharpen, the way the world held its breath. In the far distance, another engine sound rose, deeper, heavier, coming too fast. Not part of the pack, not laughing. A truck, big, unseen around the bend, and Trent, caught in his own performance, was standing in the road. For one terrifying second, the scene shifted. The bully wasn't in control anymore. He was just a boy in the wrong place. Coda lunged, not at Trent's skin, not at his legs, at the leash. He yanked sideways, dragging the pinned strap free enough to move, pulling Darlene with him out of the lane. Darlene stumbled, grabbing the stone wall for balance. Trent turned too late, eyes widening as the oncoming truck blared its horn and swerved hard. The truck missed Trent by feet. Its tires screamed. Its side mirror clipped the edge of Trent's car with a snap of plastic. When it passed, it left behind silence so thick it felt like it weighed something. Trent stood frozen, white-faced, and then as the panic drained away, the shame returned, hotter than before. He looked at Darlene. He looked at Coda, his expression hardened into something ugly and decided. Trent shoved the leash back down under his shoe like reclaiming territory. "Your dog is dangerous," he said loudly, voice recovering its arrogance. "You're dangerous!" Darlene's hair dripped soda onto her jacket. She wiped her face with a trembling hand, but her eyes stayed steady. "You almost killed someone," she said. Trent's mouth curled. "No," he replied. "You almost killed me." Briar moved closer, still filming, whispering to the camera like a narrator. "This is what happens when old people can't control their animals." Jace laughed again, but it sounded forced now, like he was trying to glue courage back into place. Landon shifted his weight. He glanced down the road where the truck had disappeared. His eyes held a flicker of uncertainty, just a flicker before he buried it under a shrug. Coda's breathing was slow, deliberate. He held himself like a trained guardian, not a wild animal. His eyes never left Trent. Darlene could feel her pulse in her throat. She wasn't afraid of the boys. She was afraid of what boys like this became when they grew into men who ran towns. She thought of her son, miles far away from this road, living a life that had already taken too much from him. She thought of how he had learned restraint the hard way, how he carried storms inside him like old metals. She did not want to summon that storm, but she could not stop what came next. Trent raised his voice, turning toward his friends. "Call it in," he ordered. "Report the, dog. Report her. I want animal control. I want cops. I want this handled." Briar's smile sharpened again. "Oh, it'll be handled." Jace cracked his knuckles as if he wanted the moment to turn physical. Coda growled again, low, steady, like thunder trapped under snow, and then down the sidewalk a figure appeared. A man 32, tall, about 6 feet, moving with the unmistakable stillness of someone trained for violence but committed to control. He had dark brown hair cut in a military style, slightly longer than regulation, and a clean-shaven face that revealed a square jaw and sharp cheekbones. His skin was light but weathered, kissed rough by northern wind, and his eyes, gray-green, were calm in a way that made the road feel suddenly smaller. He wore an old tactical combat shirt in olive gray tones, faded at the cuffs and shoulders, and worn combat pants in earth green colors with scuffed knees, old work boots, an old military watch. Nothing about him tried to look impressive. That was what made him terrifying. Miles Carraway looked at his mother, dripping soda, standing tall anyway. Then he looked at Coda, leash pinned under a stranger's shoe. Then he looked at Trent Halwick, and the sun, bright as a witness, seemed to pause. Miles spoke softly, almost gently. "Move your foot," he said. The word move did not echo. It didn't need to. Trent Halwick looked down at the boot pinning the leash and then back up at the man who had spoken. The stranger's voice hadn't been loud. It hadn't been sharp. It had carried something worse. Finality. Miles Carraway stood still, hands open at his sides, posture relaxed in a way that only people trained for violence ever managed. He didn't square his shoulders, he didn't raise his chin, he simply waited, eyes steady, gray-green and unblinking. Trent hesitated for half a second, then he laughed. It came out too quickly, too forced, like a sound practiced in front of mirrors. "Who are you supposed to be?" he asked, lifting his phone higher, angling it so the camera caught Miles's face. "Another tough guy?" Miles didn't answer him. He looked past Trent, down at the leash. He bent slightly at the waist, not submissive, not aggressive, and placed 2 fingers on the strap where it was pressed against the pavement. Coda felt the contact instantly. The German shepherd shifted his weight, chest expanding as he inhaled. His amber eyes flicked to Miles's face, searching, not for permission but for alignment. When he didn't receive a command, he held, muscles tight, breath slow. Miles's fingers didn't tremble. "Take your foot off," he said again. Same tone, same volume. Trent felt it then. The eyes of his friends on him, the phone still recording, the unfamiliar pressure of being told what to do by someone who wasn't afraid of him. Briar Knox broke the moment with a scoff. "Dude, he's bluffing," Briar said, stepping closer. He was tall and thin, with sharp features that always looked slightly amused, as if he were observing life from a safe distance. His blonde hair was styled perfectly, but there was something brittle in the way he moved, like glass, pretending to be steel. "This is a public road. You don't get to order people around." Miles finally looked up. Not at Briar, at Darlene. She stood just behind him now, soda still clinging to her hair and jacket, chin lifted with a stubborn dignity that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. Her hands were clenched, not in fear but in restraint. She shook her head just once. Not at Trent, at her son. It was the smallest motion. Anyone else would have missed it. Miles didn't. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them again. "All right," he said quietly. He straightened and took a single step back. Trent's smile spread, triumphant and relieved all at once. He lifted his foot from the leash with exaggerated slowness, as if performing mercy. "There you go," Trent said, spreading his hands. "See? We're reasonable." Jace Marin laughed loudly, stepping forward. He was broader than the others, thick through the shoulders, his hair cut short in a way that suggested he liked simple answers to complicated problems. "You should have kept walking, man," he told Miles. "You don't want this." Miles didn't look at Jace. He reached down and lifted the leash gently, coiling it in his hand with practiced ease. Coda stood when Miles did, stepping in close, pressing his flank against his leg. The contact was deliberate, grounding. Miles turned his head slightly, enough for only Darlene to hear. "Mom," he said, voice low, "stay behind me." She didn't argue. That was when the sirens came. 2 patrol cars rolled up from opposite ends of the road, lights flashing in the midday sun. The crowd that had begun to gather, tourists, locals, a couple of shop owners, shifted with the sudden relief of authority. Deputy Rowan Briggs was the first to step out. He was in his late 20s, tall and lean, with a long face that still carried the softness of someone who hadn't yet learned how to harden completely. His uniform fit him well, but not comfortably, as if he were still growing into the role. His brown hair was cut short, regulation, and his eyes moved quickly, too quickly for someone who wanted to look confident. Rowan took in the scene in a single sweep. The cars stopped at odd angles, the spilled groceries, the soda-soaked woman, the large German shepherd standing close to a man in worn military clothing. Then he saw Trent. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Trent," he said, nodding once. Not a greeting, a recognition. Trent lifted his chin. "Deputy?" Another officer stepped out of the second car, older, heavier, with a belly that strained against his vest and eyes that looked perpetually tired. Officer Caldwell didn't hurry. He walked like someone who expected the world to wait for him. "What's going on here?" Caldwell asked. Trent spoke immediately. "That dog attacked me," he said, holding up his scraped hand. "My friends and I were driving, and he lunged. I fell trying to get away." Breyer chimed in smoothly. "We've got it all on video." Rowan glanced at Miles, then at Coda. "Is that true?" Rowan asked. Miles shook his head once. "No." Rowan hesitated. "Sir, if the dog—" "He didn't bite anyone," Darlene cut in. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "He grabbed my jacket, that's all." Caldwell snorted. "That's still aggressive behavior." Miles met Caldwell's gaze for the first time. "Show me the bite," he said. Caldwell blinked. "What?" "You said he attacked," Miles repeated evenly. "Show me the bite mark." Trent's eyes flicked to his hand. The scrape was shallow, already drying. "He knocked me down," Trent said quickly. "That's assault." Miles nodded. "Then the video should show it." Caldwell's lips pressed together. "We'll review the footage." Rowan looked uncomfortable now. He cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to Miles, "I'm going to need you to step back while we sort this. Out." Miles did, immediately, completely. The ease with which he complied made Rowan's discomfort deepen. Caldwell turned to Darlene. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us to make a statement." "I will," she said, "but my son is coming." Caldwell's eyes flicked to Miles. "We don't need him." "You do," Darlene replied. "He was here." Caldwell sighed. "Fine." Animal control arrived before they left. The van was white and clean, the logo bright. The woman who stepped out was in her 40s, short with cropped dark hair and a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her name tag read Marianne Shu. Marianne moved carefully, eyes sharp but not unkind. She knelt a few feet from Coda, hands open. "Hey there," she said softly. Coda didn't move. His gaze was fixed on Miles. Marianne noticed. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is he trained?" she asked. "Yes," Miles said. "He responds to voice and hand commands." Marianne nodded. "Any history of bites?" "No." Marianne studied Coda more closely now. The relaxed jaw, the controlled posture, the lack of strain in his leash. She stood and looked at Caldwell. "I don't see signs of an active threat." Caldwell waved a hand. "Protocol says we file a report." Marianne nodded. "I'll document." She leaned closer to Coda's side, careful, respectful. Her fingers hovered near the fur where the kick had landed. Coda flinched, just slightly. Marianne's eyes narrowed. "May I?" she asked. Miles nodded. Marianne parted the fur gently. A bruise was already blooming beneath the skin, dark and spreading. Her mouth tightened. "That's not from pulling," she said quietly. "That's blunt force." Trent's smile faltered. Caldwell cleared his throat. "Let's keep moving." As they loaded into the patrol cars, Coda suddenly turned his head. Not toward Trent, not toward the officers, but toward the far end of the street. His ears snapped forward. His body went still. Miles felt it immediately, a ripple up his spine. Across the road, half hidden behind a parked delivery truck, a man stood watching. He was older than Trent, broader, dressed casually. Work jacket, baseball cap pulled low. He didn't hold a phone. He didn't smile. He met Miles's gaze. Then he turned and walked away. Miles watched him go, a cold weight settling in his chest. The station smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Darlene gave her statement calmly, detailing everything in order, voice never shaking. Miles sat beside her, silent. Rowan typed, fingers stiff. Caldwell leaned against the counter, arms crossed. When they finished, Caldwell stood. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "We'll forward this to the city attorney. In the meantime, the dog stays with you, on leash, pending review." Trent laughed softly. "You're kidding." Caldwell shot him a look. "That's enough." Trent's eyes flicked to his phone. He typed something quickly. Rowan watched, uneasy. Outside, the sun was lower now, shadows longer. As they walked out, Evan Laird stood near the steps, notebook in hand. He was in his late 30s, thin, with tired eyes and ink stains on his fingers. He wore a rumpled jacket and the expression of a man who'd learned to expect disappointment but still showed up. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" Evan said. Miles looked at Darlene. She nodded. Evan's gaze dropped briefly to Coda, then back to Miles. "That dog saved her life, didn't he?" Miles hesitated. "Yes," he said. Evan smiled faintly. "That's what I thought." Across the street, Trent stood with his friends, watching. His face was hard now, calculating. This wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The morning after the station felt quieter than it should have. Not peaceful, just muted, like a town holding its breath. Miles Carraway woke before dawn in the small rental he shared with his mother. A narrow house with thin walls and a kitchen that smelled faintly of old coffee and pine cleaner. Northern light crept in through the blinds, pale and cold, touching the edges of the room without warmth. Coda lay on the floor beside Miles's bed, head resting on his paws. In daylight, the German shepherd looked older than he had the day before, 6 or 7 years old, heavy through the chest, his black and tan coat dulled slightly where age and weather had taken their quiet toll. The faint limp in his hind leg showed more clearly now. When Miles shifted, Coda lifted his head immediately, eyes alert, tail giving one slow, careful thump against the floor. "You're up early," Miles murmured. Coda rose and stretched, careful with his bad leg, then stepped closer, pressing his shoulder lightly into Miles's knee. The contact was steady, deliberate, less a request than a confirmation. Miles dressed without hurry, the same worn tactical shirt, the same old combat pants, boots by the door. His watch still bore a faint scratch across the face from a deployment he never talked about. In the kitchen, Darlene stood at the counter, her gray hair pulled back neatly, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. The soda had dried stiffly in the collar of her jacket the night before. Now, she wore a clean sweater, plain and soft, as if yesterday had never happened. She looked up when Miles entered. "They called," she said. Miles didn't ask who. "Animal control," she continued. "Left a message, said there's a formal complaint." Miles nodded once. "I expected that." Darlene studied him closely the way mothers do when they're measuring how much trouble their children are willing to carry alone. They said it could take weeks. I know, she hesitated. They also said there was another report about the house. Miles's jaw tightened just slightly. What kind of report? Darlene looked down at her mug. Noise, disorderly conduct, an aggressive animal. Miles exhaled slowly through his nose. That doesn't even make sense, she said quickly. We don't. I know, Miles replied. He knelt and rested a hand against Coda's chest. The dog's heart beat steady under his palm, strong and unbothered. They're not trying to win, Miles said quietly. They're trying to exhaust us. By mid-morning, the town had begun to whisper. It wasn't loud, it never was. Rumors didn't shout in places like Brightwater Point, they drifted. They slid into conversations at gas pumps and grocery aisles, carried on the same breath as the weather. Miles felt it when he walked into the small diner near the lake. Sarah Green was behind the counter that morning. She was in her early 30s, tall and slim, with light brown hair pulled into a low ponytail that always seemed to come loose by the end of a shift. Her skin was pale, freckled lightly across her nose and arms, and her eyes held a tired kindness. The kind that came from years of service work and too many apologies made on behalf of other people. Sarah had grown up in Brightwater Point. She knew everyone's names and everyone's habits. She smiled at Miles when he entered, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Miles replied. Coda stayed close to Miles's leg, lying down once they reached a corner booth. A few patrons glanced over, then looked away too quickly. Sarah poured coffee and brought it over herself, setting the mug down gently. "You okay?" Miles looked up at her. "We're fine." She pressed her lips together. "People are talking." He waited. "They're saying the dog's dangerous," she continued. "That he attacked someone's kid." Miles didn't react. Sarah lowered her voice. "I know that's not true. I saw you yesterday. I saw how he listens." Miles nodded once. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Trent's mother came in earlier." Miles looked at her now. "She didn't say anything," Sarah said. "Just stared, like she was deciding where to put a mark." Sarah had learned that look early in life. Her father had worked maintenance for the city until an injury took him off ladders and into early retirement. Since then, she'd learned how power didn't always announce itself. It observed. When she walked away, Miles noticed she didn't refill his coffee without asking. The way she usually did, Coda's ears twitched. Miles followed his gaze to the window. Outside, a white animal control van was parked across the street. The woman who stepped out introduced herself again as Marianne Shu. In daylight, she looked different than she had the day before. Short, compact, her dark hair cropped close to her head, movements efficient and precise. There was a faint scar along her left forearm, pale against her skin, the kind you got from an animal that hadn't meant to hurt, but hadn't known better. She crouched near Coda, clipboard tucked under her arm. "Hi again?" she said, voice calm. "Mind if I check him once more?" Miles nodded. "Go ahead." Marianne didn't reach for Coda right away. She watched him first, the relaxed jaw, the steady breathing, the way his eyes tracked her hands without tension. 6 or 7, she asked. "About that," Miles replied. "He's trained," Marianne said, not a question. "Yes," she nodded. "Not police training?" "No." "Private? Informal?" Marianne smiled faintly. "Those are usually the best kind." She examined the bruise again, documenting carefully, then stood. "I've read the complaint," she said. "It claims he lunged." Miles waited. "I don't see evidence of that," Marianne continued. "But procedure requires a home visit." Darlene stepped forward. "That's fine." Marianne met her eyes. "I'll need to speak with your landlord." Miles felt the words land like a stone. As Marianne turned to leave, Coda did something he hadn't done since the road. He rose and moved to the door, not blocking it, not threatening, just standing there, body angled slightly, ears forward, eyes fixed on the white van outside. He let out a single low huff. Not a growl, a warning meant for someone else. Marianne paused, looking from Coda to Miles. Does he do that often? Miles shook his head. Only when something's wrong. Marianne studied Coda for a long moment, then nodded. Then I suggest you keep records of everything. The landlord's name was Henry Wallace. He was in his late 50s with a soft belly and thinning hair that he combed carefully to hide more than it could. He wore sweaters year-round and spoke with the practiced politeness of someone who preferred conflict to arrive by letter. He met Miles and Darlene on the porch that afternoon, hands folded, eyes uneasy. I've been getting calls, Henry said. Complaints, concerns. From who? Darlene asked. Henry shifted. I can't say. Miles looked at him steadily. Yes, you can. Henry sighed. From the city, from neighbors, from people who say they're worried. About what? Miles asked. Henry glanced at Coda, who sat calmly by Miles's side. About the dog. He's never harmed anyone, Darlene said. Henry nodded quickly. I know. I've seen him. But pressure is pressure. Miles let the silence stretch. Henry cleared his throat. I'm not evicting you, not yet, but if this escalates... Miles nodded. We'll handle it. Henry's shoulders sagged with relief, as if the decision had been made for him long before he spoke. That evening, Evan Laird knocked on the door. The reporter looked more worn today, dark circles under his eyes, jacket rumpled, notebook already half-filled. He didn't smile when Miles opened the door. They're filing a civil complaint, Evan said without preamble. Not criminal, civil. For what? Negligence, emotional distress, endangerment. Miles leaned against the doorframe. On what grounds? Evan's mouth twisted. Doesn't matter, they want discovery, depositions, time. Darlene listened from the kitchen, hands clasped. Evan glanced past Miles, lowering his voice. There's something else. Someone's been calling around about your military record. Miles's eyes hardened. Fishing, Evan continued, trying to see if they can frame you as unstable. Miles closed his eyes briefly. Coda rose and pressed his head against Miles's thigh. I won't print rumors, Evan said, but others might. Miles nodded. Then print the facts. Evan hesitated. You sure you want this public? Miles looked at his mother, then at his dog. Yes, he said. Night settled over Brightwater Point slowly. Lake reflecting moonlight like a mirror that remembered everything. Miles sat on the porch steps, Coda beside him, both watching the street. Cars passed occasionally, no sirens, no shouting, just waiting. Inside, Darlene folded laundry with deliberate care, as if order itself were an act of defiance. Miles rested his hand on Coda's neck, feeling the familiar warmth, the steady presence. They think they can bury us in paperwork, Miles said quietly. Coda lifted his head, eyes reflecting the porch light. Miles exhaled. They don't know how patient we are. The house remained standing, for now, and the silence, thick, deliberate, pressed in around them, shaping itself into something that felt like the beginning of a longer fight. The envelope arrived without a stamp. It was slipped halfway through the mail slot sometime before dawn. The edge creased as if someone had hesitated before pushing it all the way in. Miles found it when he stepped outside with Coda just after sunrise. The air still cold enough to sting his lungs. The paper was thick, legal, heavy with intent. Coda noticed it first. The German shepherd lowered his head and sniffed the envelope without touching it. Nose hovering a few inches above the floor, his ears tilted back. not in fear but in the wary way he reacted to unfamiliar scents that carried urgency. He let out a slow breath through his nose, then looked up at Miles. Miles picked up the envelope and read the name typed neatly on the front. Miles Carraway. Inside was a notice of intent to pursue civil action. Negligence, emotional distress, endangerment of public safety. The language was polished and cold, every sentence sharpened to cut time, money, and energy away piece by piece. At the bottom was a law firm's name, one Miles recognized, not local, expensive. Darlene stood behind him in the doorway, wrapped in a cardigan despite the heater humming inside. "So it starts," she said quietly. Miles folded the papers with deliberate care and set them on the counter. "It already started," he replied. "They're just done pretending." By late morning, the pressure had found new ways to surface. Miles drove Darlene to her volunteer shift at the community library, a place she'd helped organize for years. The building sat near the water, modest and welcoming, its windows filled with handmade posters and announcements for events that rarely drew more than a dozen people. As they pulled into the lot, Darlene hesitated with her hand on the door handle. "They called me yesterday," she said. Miles turned toward her. "Who did?" "The coordinator," Darlene replied. "She said some donors were concerned." "About what?" Darlene gave a small, humorless smile. "About the kind of attention I might bring." Miles felt something tighten in his chest. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd take a few weeks off," Darlene said, "until things settled." Miles nodded, though the word settled felt like a lie. Coda shifted in the back seat, sensing the change in tone. He leaned forward slightly, placing his chin between the front seats, eyes flicking between them. Darlene reached back and rested her fingers against his muzzle. "You did good," she murmured. "None of this is your fault." Coda licked her knuckles once, gentle and quick, then settled back again. The first confrontation came before noon. Miles was fixing a loose step on the porch, something he'd meant to do for months, when a black SUV rolled slowly to a stop in front of the house. The vehicle was immaculate, the kind that looked out of place on a street where most cars bore scratches and salt stains. A man stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed casually but deliberately, dark jeans, clean boots, a jacket that cost more than it looked like it should. His hair was dark, cut short, and his beard was trimmed with careful precision. His face carried the calm confidence of someone used to being listened to. He smiled as he approached. "Mr. Carraway," the man said, "I'm Daniel Mercer." Miles straightened slowly. "What do you want?" Daniel held up his hands, palms open. "Just a conversation." Coda rose immediately and positioned himself between Miles and the man, stance wide and steady. His eyes were fixed on Daniel's face, expression unreadable. Daniel glanced at the dog, then back to Miles. "Impressive animal." Miles didn't respond. Daniel sighed lightly. "I represent the Hallwick family, unofficially." "That's not how representation works," Miles said. Daniel smiled again. "It does when everyone agrees not to argue about it." Miles rested his hammer on the step and crossed his arms. "You're trespassing." Daniel nodded. "I'll be quick." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This situation doesn't benefit anyone. You've got complaints, legal notices, reporters sniffing around. We can make it all go away." Miles held his gaze. "How?" Daniel shrugged. "Settlement, generous, relocation assistance, a non-disclosure agreement." Darlene stepped onto the porch then, her presence sudden but composed. She looked at Daniel with cool curiosity. "And my dog?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "Animal control would close their file." Coda growled, not loud, not threatening, just enough to make the air vibrate. Daniel took a step back instinctively, then caught himself. "See?" he said, recovering. "That's exactly the problem." Miles felt the line inside him harden. "We're not moving," he said, "and you're done here." Daniel's smile faded. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Miles shook his head. "You already did." Daniel glanced once more at Coda, then turned and walked back to the SUV without another word. That night, long after the street had gone quiet, Coda rose from his place by the door. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He stood perfectly still, ears forward, eyes locked on the front window. Miles felt it before he heard anything. A shift in the air, a pressure that didn't belong. Outside, a shadow moved across the lawn. Then came the sound, a soft thud. Miles was on his feet instantly. He opened the door just enough to see a paper bag lying near the porch steps. Coda strained forward, hackles raised, but stopped the moment Miles placed a hand on his collar. Inside the bag was raw meat, and beneath it a small plastic container dusted with white powder. Miles's blood ran cold. The veterinarian confirmed it the next morning. Dr. Ellen Price ran a private clinic just outside town, her office tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered bakery. She was in her early 50s with iron gray hair cut short and eyes that missed very little. Years of working with injured animals had left her movements precise and her patience thin for nonsense. She examined the container carefully, then looked up at Miles. "Rat poison," she said. "Strong, enough to kill a dog Coda's size in under an hour." Darlene closed her eyes. Dr. Price met Miles's gaze. "Someone wanted him dead." Miles nodded. "I know." Dr. Price straightened. "You reported this?" "Not yet," she frowned. "Why?" "Because I want it documented properly," Miles replied. "And I want to know who benefits." Dr. Price studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll write a report, detailed." Coda sat at Miles's side throughout the visit, eyes alert, posture calm despite the tension. When Dr. Price knelt to check him over, Coda allowed it, without protest, tail resting still against the floor. "He knows," she said quietly to Miles. "Some dogs do." The story broke that afternoon. Evan Laird's article went live online, careful and precise. It didn't accuse, it documented. The timeline, the complaints, the attempted settlement, the poisoned bait. It named no suspects, it didn't have to. By evening, calls began to come in, from advocacy groups, from distant relatives, from people Miles had served with years ago and hadn't spoken to since. The town reacted in its own way. Some neighbors crossed the street when Miles walked by. Others nodded in silent support. A few left bags of groceries on the porch without knocking. Coda watched it all from the window, his gaze following each movement with quiet intensity. Miles sat at the table, papers spread out before him, the law firm's letter resting on top like a challenge. "They thought we'd fold," Darlene said softly. Miles looked up at her. "They still do." Outside, headlights swept briefly across the wall as a car slowed, then moved on. Miles reached down and rested his hand on Coda's neck. "They're going to learn," he said quietly, "that some lines don't break." The house stood firm against the dark. So did the dog. Brightwater Point did not wake up to sirens. It woke to smoke. Miles smelled it before he saw it. Sharp and bitter, threading through the cold morning air like a warning that had chosen to arrive late. He was already awake, boots on, kettle forgotten on the stove, when Coda lifted his head and froze. The German shepherd didn't bark. He stood, body rigid, ears pitched forward so hard they seemed to strain against his skull. His chest expanded with a slow breath. nostrils flaring as if the air itself had begun to speak. Miles followed his gaze. Across the block, a low gray plume rose where it shouldn't have been, behind the row of aging apartments scheduled for redevelopment, a place everyone knew was half empty and poorly maintained. The smoke thickened, curling upward, then flattened by the wind coming off the lake. Miles grabbed his jacket. "Stay close," he said, not a command so much as a promise. Coda moved with him, the limp in his hind leg barely noticeable, when adrenaline took hold. They reached the corner as the first windows shattered. Fire rolled through dry beams and neglected wiring with a sound like tearing fabric. Someone screamed. A door burst open and a man stumbled out coughing, eyes wide and unfocused. Another followed, dragging a child wrapped in a blanket. Miles didn't stop to think. He stepped into the open, voice cutting through the panic with a calm that felt borrowed from another life. "Everyone out. Now. Leave everything." People moved when he spoke. They always did. He pulled a woman free from a doorway choked with smoke, then turned back again. Coda circled the edge of the building, nose working relentlessly, paws clicking on concrete. The dog's eyes were bright, intent, his tail low and steady. No fear, only work. They went in together. Inside the hallway was a tunnel of heat and confusion. Miles used his jacket to shield his face, counting steps, listening for sound. Coda guided him toward Dea. It's scratching at a door, then another, barking once to mark a living presence behind smoke-darkened glass. They found an elderly man slumped near a stairwell, breath shallow, hands shaking. Miles lifted him without ceremony and carried him out into the cold rain that had begun to fall, steam rising where water met flame. Outside, neighbors gathered in small clusters, faces lit orange by the fire. Some stood barefoot. Some held pets close to their chests like proof they were still here. And then Miles saw her. Sarah Green stood near the curb, wrapped in a borrowed sweater that hung loose on her tall, slender frame. Her light brown hair was damp and unpinned, strands clinging to her pale cheeks. Her freckles stood out sharply in the firelight, and her eyes, usually tired but kind, were wide with something close to terror. She scanned the doorway again and again. "Coda," she whispered when she saw him emerge, relief breaking across her face. Then her gaze snapped back to the smoke. "He went back in," she said, voice cracking. "Your dog, he went back in." As if summoned by her words, Coda appeared again, dragging an older man by the sleeve of his coat. The dog's injured leg buckled under the effort, but he did not let go until the man collapsed onto wet pavement, coughing and alive. Cheers rose and died quickly, swallowed by the crackle of flame. Coda turned immediately and went back toward the doorway. Miles met him halfway. "Stay," Miles said, firm now. Coda hesitated, just a breath, then obeyed, standing rigid as Miles disappeared into the smoke once more. Inside, the heat had worsened. A beam crashed down behind him, sparks leaping like startled birds. He found a young mother crouched in a bathroom, clutching a toddler whose cries had gone hoarse. Miles wrapped the child in his jacket, pressed the woman forward with steady hands, repeating the same words until her legs remembered how to move. Outside, paramedics took over. Fire crews arrived in force, hoses cutting white arcs through the night. The building burned down to its bones, but when the last person was counted, no one was left inside. Coda lay on the ground, breathing hard. Blood darkened the fur along his back. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, hands hovering uselessly. "He's hurt," she said, tears streaking her face. "He saved them! He saved everyone!" Miles knelt and pressed his hands against the wound, voice low and urgent. "Hey, boy, stay with me." Coda's tail thumped once, weak, deliberate. That was enough, As dawn crept in, pale and unforgiving, the crowd did not disperse. They gathered instead, wrapped in blankets, sharing coffee from mismatched mugs. Someone passed around dry clothes. Someone else brought a clipboard from a volunteer's car and began writing names. An older man with a thick gray beard, Harold Vance, a retired electrician with hands scarred by years of work, stepped forward. He looked at the burned-out shell of the building and then at the people beside him. "This wasn't an accident," he said. The words didn't explode. They settled. A woman nodded. Another spoke of inspections that never came, of warnings ignored, of papers signed they hadn't understood. The air shifted, not toward anger but toward recognition. Miles listened from the edge of the circle, Coda on a stretcher beside him, sedated but breathing. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The investigation arrived later that morning, crisp and official. Yellow tape went up. Clipboards appeared. Questions were asked with careful distance. Among the officials was Deputy Rowan Briggs, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He avoided Miles at first, then finally approached, voice low. "State's taken this," he said. "Too many red flags." Miles nodded. Across the street, Trent Hallwick stood with his friends, watching from behind police tape. His jacket was immaculate. His face was pale. When he met Miles's gaze, he looked away. Sarah found Miles near the ambulance before it pulled out with Coda inside. "They're saying the fire started in the utility crawl space," she said. "That it spread fast because the wiring was old." Miles waited. "They're also saying," Sarah continued, swallowing, "that the redevelopment project had a deadline, that someone wanted the place empty." Miles closed his eyes briefly. Sarah touched his arm, tentative. "I'll talk," she said. "If anyone asks. I saw things. We all did." Miles looked at her, really looked, at the strength that had grown quietly behind service smiles and long shifts. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, eyes shining. "He's going to be okay, right?" "He's strong," Miles replied. It was the truest answer he had. Coda survived surgery. Dr. Ellen Price called just before sunset, her voice steady. "The beam missed his spine by inches," she said. "The gash will scar. His leg will always trouble him, but his heart," she paused. "His heart's stubborn." Miles sat on the porch steps as the light faded, phone pressed to his ear. The house behind him quiet in a way that felt earned. Inside, Darlene folded blankets brought by neighbors she'd barely known by name. She moved slowly, carefully, as if gentleness itself were a form of thanks. When the call ended, Miles didn't move right away. The streetlights came on one by one, reflecting off damp pavement. The burned building smoldered in the distance, its outline stark against the darkening sky. Evan Laird appeared at the end of the block, notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't rush. He waited until Miles looked up. "I won't print rumors," Evan said when he reached the porch. "But people are talking, and this time they're listening to each other." Miles nodded. "Good." Evan hesitated. "This isn't just about the fire." "I know. It's about who benefits from silence." Miles looked toward the empty stretcher spot where Coda had lain hours earlier. "Then silence is over." Night returned, quieter now. Miles slept in the chair by the door, boots still on, waking to every sound. Without Coda's breathing beside him, the house felt larger and less certain. But when dawn came again, it brought something new. A yellow legal pad lay on the kitchen table, names written carefully down the page. Darlene had added dates, notes, small arrows connecting stories that had never been told aloud before. Miles traced the ink with his finger. Not a plan, a beginning. Outside, the town stirred, slow, cautious, awake in a way it hadn't been before. The fire had taken walls and roofs and memories. It had also taken the last excuse. Miles stood and pulled on his jacket. Some things, once burned clear, could finally be seen. The house felt different without Coda. It wasn't just the absence of sound, the soft scrape of paws on wood, the steady rhythm of breathing near the door. It was the absence of certainty. Miles moved through the rooms more carefully now, as if the walls themselves were listening. He woke before sunrise, the habit unbroken, and brewed coffee he barely tasted. On the kitchen table lay the yellow legal pad Darlene had started the night before. More names had been added since then. Different handwriting, different stories. Each line was neat, deliberate, as if the people who wrote them were afraid that sloppiness might weaken the truth. Darlene stood by the window, arms folded loosely across her chest. The lake beyond the houses was smooth and pale, reflecting the early sky like an unfinished thought. "They called again," she said without turning, "from the library." Miles set his mug down. "And?" "They apologized," Darlene replied. "Said they'd overreacted. Said they hoped I'd come back when things settled." Miles almost smiled. Almost. "What did you say?" "That I'd think about it," she said. "I told them I was busy." Miles nodded. Busy was accurate. By mid-morning, the town council meeting room was full in a way it hadn't been in years. Brightwater Point liked its meetings quiet, thin attendance, predictable agendas, polite disagreements that ended with handshakes. Today, folding chairs lined the walls. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Some clutched folders. Others held nothing but folded hands and determined expressions. Miles sat in the back row, posture relaxed but alert, his presence unobtrusive by design. He wore the same worn tactical shirt and old boots, blending into the background of working people and retirees. Darlene sat near the front. Sarah Green slipped into the seat beside her, her tall frame folding awkwardly into the narrow chair. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, hair pulled back in a low ponytail. Without the diner apron, she looked younger, more exposed. Her pale skin flushed easily as she glanced around the room, then down at the papers in her hands. "You okay?" Darlene whispered. Sarah nodded. "I've waited a long time to say some of this." At the front of the room, Councilman Robert Hale adjusted the microphone. Hale was in his early 60s, with thinning silver hair and a careful smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore a pressed suit and a flag pin on his lapel, the uniform of someone who believed presentation could still substitute for accountability. "We'll begin," Hale said, tapping the gavel lightly. "Please remember to keep comments brief and respectful." The irony did not go unnoticed. The first speaker was a woman named Louise Carter. She was short and round, with white hair curled carefully away from her face, and a voice that carried warmth even when she was angry. A retired school teacher, she stood with a stack of papers clutched against her chest like a shield. "I've lived here 42 years, Louise said, "and in that time I've learned that when things keep going wrong for the same people, it's not bad luck, it's neglect." She spoke of maintenance requests ignored, of inspections delayed, of a fire alarm that hadn't worked in years. Others followed. Harold Vance stood again, his scarred hands gripping the podium. He spoke of rewired circuits and corner cutting, of being told to sign off years ago on work he hadn't been allowed to finish properly. Sarah's turn came later. She stood slowly, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room once before settling on the council. "My name is Sarah Green," she said. "I work at the diner. Or I did." Her voice wavered for half a second, then steadied. "I've seen the cars racing on the lake road for months. I've heard people complain. I've watched reports get filed and disappear, and when someone finally, Got hurt. When someone finally stood up, everything got very quiet. She paused, fingers tightening around her papers. I don't think quiet means peace, Sarah said. I think it means fear. A murmur rippled through the room. Miles watched Trent Hallwick from the corner of his eye. Trent sat near the aisle, jacket immaculate, jaw clenched. His friends flanked him, restless, tapping feet and checking phones. For the first time since this had begun, Trent looked unsure, not afraid exactly, but unsettled. The rules had shifted and no one had explained the new ones to him. Councilman Hale cleared his throat. These allegations are serious, he said. We'll be reviewing all documentation. Miles felt the words land with practiced emptiness. Halfway through the meeting, Miles's phone vibrated. Once, he glanced down, a text from Dr. Ellen Price. He's awake. Miles closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, Darlene caught the change in his posture. She didn't know why, but she smiled just slightly as if she felt the shift too. The veterinary clinic smelled of antiseptic and quiet resilience. Miles arrived just after noon, the sun high and unkind. Dr. Ellen Price met him at the door, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back more tightly than usual. He's not happy, she said. Oh, but he's stable. Coda lay in a padded enclosure near the back, bandaged heavily along his spine and hind leg. The scar would be long, unmistakable. His eyes opened when Miles entered, amber and alert despite the haze of medication. His tail moved once, then again. Miles knelt, resting his forearms against the metal edge, careful not to touch the wound. Hey, boy, he said softly. Coda's breathing deepened. His gaze never left Miles's face. Dr. Price watched from a respectful distance. He tried to stand earlier, she said. Didn't get far, but he tried. Miles nodded. That sounded right. He's lucky, she'd continued. But luck isn't what saved him. Miles knew that too. By late afternoon, the town had begun to choose sides. It showed in small ways. A nod held a moment longer. A door left unlocked. A coffee paid for by someone who didn't wait to be thanked. It also showed in resistance. Daniel Mercer's firm released a statement calling the fire an unfortunate accident and warning against irresponsible speculation. The wording was smooth, confident, dismissive. Evan Laird countered within hours. The article didn't accuse. It connected. Permits, deadlines, deferred inspections, emails obtained through open records requests, names that appeared again and again in places they shouldn't have. Miles read it slowly at the kitchen table while Darlene prepared soup she would probably never finish. They're running out of room, she said quietly. Miles looked up. They still have money. Darlene nodded. Money runs fast, courage doesn't. That evening, Deputy Rowan Briggs knocked on the door. He looked worse than he had days before. Dark circles under his eyes, uniform rumpled, hair slightly out of place. He held his hat in both hands, fingers worrying the brim. I shouldn't be here, Rowan said. Miles stepped aside anyway. Rowan sat stiffly at the table, glancing once at the legal pad, then away. Internal Affairs opened a preliminary review, he said. About the fire, about prior reports. Darlene set a bowl in front of him. Rowan shook his head, embarrassed. They asked me for everything. Rowan continued, dusty. Every call. Every time a report got downgraded or delayed. Miles waited. I gave it to them, Rowan said. His voice cracked slightly. All of it. Silence filled the room, not empty but full. They'll try to make me disappear, Rowan added. Transfer, desk duty, something. Miles met his eyes. You did the right thing. Rowan swallowed. That doesn't always mean the same thing as the safe thing. I know, Miles replied. Rowan stood to leave, hesitating at the door. Your dog, he said. He changed something. People saw it. You should know that. After he left, the house felt warmer. Miles returned to the clinic just before closing. Coda was sleeping this time, chest rising slowly beneath the bandages. Miles sat beside him, one hand resting lightly against the cool metal frame. I'm not leaving, he murmured. Not now. Coda's ear twitched. Outside, Brightwater Point settled into evening. Lights flickered on across the lake. Somewhere a radio played too loud, then was turned down. The town was learning how to listen. And listening, Miles knew, was the first step toward answering back. The charges did not arrive with fanfare. They came quietly, the way truth often does when it no longer needs permission. Miles learned about them on a gray morning, the lake hidden under low cloud. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Darlene, both of them sorting papers that had multiplied in careful stacks. Affidavits, inspection reports, printed emails with dates highlighted in yellow. Coda was still at the clinic recovering, and the house carried that same hollow space where certainty used to live. Evan Laird called just after 9. They filed, he said. His voice was steady, but there was a note beneath it. Relief, maybe. State level, arson investigation tied to redevelopment fraud, obstruction, evidence tampering. Miles closed his eyes briefly. Who? Evan exhaled. Multiple names. Contractors, inspectors, a shell company connected to the Halwick project. It's not just the kids anymore. Darlene set her pen down. Her hands were steady. Thank you for telling us. Be careful, Evan added. This part makes people desperate. After the call ended, the house was quiet again. Not the waiting quiet from before, something different. Like a held breath being released. They're going to say we did this, Darlene said. Miles nodded. They already are. The press conference was held at the courthouse steps that afternoon. Cameras lined the sidewalk. Microphones bristled like antennae angled toward the podium. Officials stood in neat rows, expressions rehearsed into something between concern and control. Miles stayed back, leaning against the stone wall, hands in his pockets. He wore the same faded tactical shirt and old boots, a deliberate refusal to dress the moment up into something it wasn't. Darlene stood beside him, posture straight, eyes calm. Across the steps, Trent Halwick arrived with his parents. Trent looked smaller than he had weeks ago. His jacket was still immaculate, his hair carefully styled, but the confidence had thinned around the edges. His father, Mayor Richard Halwick, stood rigid, jaw clenched, the lines around his mouth deeper than before. The man looked older now, as if the town had finally caught up to him. When the statement ended, reporters surged forward. Questions flew, accusations, requests for comment. Mayor Halwick declined to speak. Trent did not look at Miles. In the middle of the chaos, Miles felt it, a familiar pressure, the subtle shift in air that had saved lives before he turned. Across the street, an older woman stood alone near the bus stop, watching the courthouse with careful eyes. She wore a simple coat and carried a canvas bag. When Miles met her gaze, she nodded once, not in greeting, in recognition. Later, Miles would learn her name, Grace Holloway, a former city clerk who had quietly copied files for years before retiring early after health issues. That afternoon, she simply watched, as if confirming something she'd known all along. By evening, the town had begun to rearrange itself. It happened in small ways first. A contractor's truck removed from a job site. A notice posted on the library door announcing funding review. A council member's resignation letter leaked to the local paper. Miles drove to the clinic as dusk settled. the sky bruised purple and gold. Dr. Ellen Price met him in the hallway, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "He's asking for you," she said. Coda lay in a recovery pen near the window, bandages clean and tight. His fur had been shaved around the wound, the scar stark and undeniable. When Miles knelt, Coda lifted his head, eyes clear and intent. His tail moved once, then again. "That's enough," Miles murmured, a smile touching his mouth for the first time in days. Dr. Price watched quietly. "He'll need time," she said. "Physical therapy, short walks, no heroics." Miles nodded. He's not that kind of hero. When Miles stood to leave, Dr. Price added, "Someone tried to access his records this morning, through a private firm." Miles turned. "Did they get anything?" "No," she said, "but it means you're still being watched." Miles looked back at Coda. "We always were." The sentence came down a week later. It wasn't the end. It was a beginning dressed as accountability. The redevelopment project was suspended indefinitely. Licenses were revoked, fines levied. Several men who had always sat comfortably behind desks now stood in courtrooms blinking under fluorescent lights. Trent and his friends were charged, not with arson, but with reckless endangerment, obstruction, and coordinated harassment. Their punishments were not cinematic, no handcuffs in the street, no shouted apologies. They lost cars, licenses, privileges. They were assigned community service, hours and hours of it, under supervision that did not care who their parents were. The judge's voice was measured as she spoke. "Actions have weight," she said. "You will learn that weight." Mayor Halwick resigned before the final ruling. His statement was brief and carefully worded. The town did not applaud. The diner reopened on a Tuesday. No balloons, no banners, just coffee and the low hum of ordinary life returning to itself. Sarah Green worked the counter again, her hair cut a little shorter now, her posture straighter. When she saw Miles enter with Coda at his side, walking slowly, carefully, she smiled without hesitation. "Table's ready," she said. Coda settled near the door, bandaged but present. A living threshold. People stepped around him with quiet respect. Children approached slowly, asking permission before touching his head. He accepted their hands with calm dignity. Miles sat at the counter, a mug placed in front of him before he asked. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. The lake reflected them like small promises. Sarah leaned closer. "You staying?" Miles considered the question, his gaze resting on Coda, who watched the room with gentle vigilance. "Yes," he said, "for now." She nodded. "Good." That night the town slept, not all at once, not without memory, but with something like peace. Miles walked the lake road with Coda under a sky scrubbed clean by rain. The dog moved slower now, favoring his leg, but his head was high, his senses sharp. Each step was deliberate. At the overlook, they stopped. Miles rested his hand on Coda's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. "You did what you were meant to do," he said softly. Coda looked out over the water, ears lifting at distant sounds only he could hear. Miles understood then what the town had learned the hard way. Justice did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as people who refused to look away, as records kept, as voices raised together, as a wounded dog who kept moving forward anyway. When they turned back toward home, the lights were on, the road was quiet, and nothing that mattered was invisible anymore. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive like thunder, loud, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. But the truth this story leaves us with is quieter and far more demanding. The miracle did not come as fire from the sky or sudden wealth or instant justice. It came through awareness, through courage that refused to look away, through a wounded dog who sensed danger before it had a name, through ordinary people who chose to stand when silence felt safer. Scripture reminds us that faith can move mountains, but most days God moves through people, through hands that document the truth, through voices that speak when fear tightens the throat, through instincts placed in animals and conscience placed in humans, working together in ways we may not understand until much later. In our daily lives, injustice rarely announces itself loudly. It hides in routine, in power, in the way things have always been. This story asks us a simple but uncomfortable question. When the moment comes, will we be the ones who stay quiet or the ones who stand? If this story touched something in you, do not let that feeling pass unused. Share it with someone who needs courage today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, or a moment when you chose to speak instead of stay silent. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue telling stories that heal, restore faith, and remind us what quiet strength looks like. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He protect the vulnerable in your life, and may He give you the courage to recognize the miracle when it arrives, softly through compassion asking you to act.